As I said in the title, our current grading system is deeply flawed. The current educational system puts grades over student growth and student learning. And this contradiction is especially concerning when the entire purpose of education is for student learning and student growth. This prioritization isn't only in our schools, it's also ingrained in our thinking. Students constantly prevent themselves from taking risks or the possibility of failure because of the effect it may have on their grades. And this is a major problem because people need to make mistakes. They need to fail to learn how to succeed and to grow. And teachers are affected by this too, because they're oftentimes forced to give grades that may ruin or prevent student and teacher collaboration. Thankfully, however, there has been an abundance of proposed solutions, but what I'm focusing on is student self-assessment. I believe that student self-assessment plays a major role in ungrading our current educational system. Not only that, but student self-assessment is extremely necessary in education. Students need to reflect on their time in the classroom, what they feel they have learned, and how they've changed in order to grow. This, in collaboration with student and teacher dialogue / live feedback, I think can largely stand in place of our current grading system. And I understand that each professor and each teacher will have their own way of going about this. What's really important is that both students and teachers are allowed to thrive, and this is only possible when they both have a voice in education. The first problem that I think is most apparent is that grades get in the way of learning. This issue is the most important in my opinion because the entire purpose of education, as I said, is learning. And if a tool for education gets in the way of that, it's a huge problem. And this is exactly what Tim Gorichanaz, a professor of informational studies at Drexel University, found when analyzing 8 students' experiences with ungrading. And he puts it best when speaking about the gamification of education. Trying to be a good student in this sense, within a setting where grades take center stage, led students to conceptualize learning and grades as a game. Grades were the main focus of these students, not them learning, and they saw grades as a game, so they tried to get good at getting good grades. And they did well for the sake of doing well, not for the sake of learning. Now, for my second point, grades add unnecessary stress. This goes hand in hand with my last issue. If grades are the sole focus of a student's education, then these grades can, and most of the time do, take a huge toll on the student's well-being. MentalHealth.net reflected this reality in a recent survey they conducted, where over one-third of students said exams were their biggest source of stress, and 23% said college coursework and homework were the top stressors. Exams, coursework, and homework all share one thing in common, and that's that they're graded. On top of this, the American College Health Association found that 35.3% of college students reported stress as a reason for negatively affecting their academic work. To break this down, bad grades cause students to feel worse about not only their work, but themselves. And this can cause their work to decline even further, leading to a very concerning positive feedback loop. And getting good grades isn't a stress-free experience either. Because there is this expectation for students to have a high GPA and maintain it, they will often not feel rewarded for their hard work. And because grades are an average, any failure will leave a stain on the student's GPA. Grades that are based on self-assessment can help combat this. And this is exactly what Gorichanaz found in his experience with ungrading. He puts it best when saying, ungrading in the active classroom environment meant less stress for the students. Without the distraction of grades, students found themselves able to engage more fully in the class. Grades hurt professors too. Not only do grades add stress to students, they add stress to teachers and professors as well. Aaron Blackwelder, teacher of 24 years, talks about his experience of grading in his article, "But going gradeless taught me about doing the actual work." When Blackwelder first started teaching, his students were very interested in his class and in reading and writing. But as years passed, students' interest began to slip, and Blackwelder felt that he had threatened students with bad grades to get them motivated. Eventually, though, Blackwelder had an epiphany. He realized he was focusing more on how his colleagues and administrators saw him, and not how his students did. He focused more on grading than the quality of his assignments. He had become increasingly critical of student work. Blackwelder was consumed by this idea of grading. He believed that his effectiveness as a teacher and his worth was a reflection of the grades he gave. This causes more stress and less learning for both parties. Grades are not a good indicator of progress. People often support the current grading system because they think it's an efficient, easy way to show student progress. Students or anyone who needs to check student progress can just go on a website or look at a piece of paper and see an easily understandable letter. And sure, I don't disagree that this is efficient or easy, but I argue when looking at something as complex as understanding and growth, it isn't the best to take the easy way out. People learn at different rates, and people have different struggles. Jesse Stommel, co-founder and executive director of Hybrid Pedagogy, a digital journal centered around teaching, learning, and technology, and professor of over 20 years, puts it best when saying, "Human interaction is incredibly complex. Grades can't be normed if we recognize the complexity of learners and learning contexts." Learning is extremely complex, and the current way we grade and the basis of those grades just simply aren't capable of showing this complexity. I mean, do you really believe that a student deserves a worse grade just because they struggled initially, even if they ended up at the same place as the rest of the class? Because I don't think that's fair. Maybe it'd be fair if grades were just an indicator of progress, but we know that isn't the case. Grades are a basis from which we are judged. Grades decides what schools we get into and what jobs we get, and as I mentioned before, they often decide how we feel. And I hope you agree with me when I say it isn't fair nor is it right to take the easy way out when these are the stakes for our students. Grades limit student and teacher creativity. When the goal is grades and not learning, students stop themselves from being creative and stick to what they know works. Gorichanaz touches on this when saying, traditional grades emphasize only certain forms of expertise and do not encourage students to discover other ways of solving problems, thus dampening creativity and limiting perspective. He then continues this idea when expressing how ungrading can remedy this. The students in my study experienced time for reflection and space to think. This helped increase creative risk-taking. Students experienced the assignments as more meaningful and felt they had more creative freedom in the classroom. The typical structure of class and grades doesn't allow for much creativity. Most of the time, students are just expected to memorize. And I believe this is what Gorichanaz is getting at when he brings up certain forms of expertise. Ungrading, and more specifically self-reflection, helps remedy this, because the way of learning is upended. Students aren't just mindlessly receiving and regurgitating information. They are active in their learning. They seek solutions and decide what they learn, and they are conscious of how and why they are learning. So now that I talked about all the problems of grading, I want to get to the solution. Now, there are many solutions, and some involve just getting rid of grading altogether. I don't necessarily disagree with this, but I want this advice to be accessible to all. And I know for many teachers, this just isn't an option. So what I want to focus on is self-assessment and live feedback. I truly believe that these are the first of many steps necessary in fixing our education system and giving some hope and control to the students. Currently, the basis of student grades are performance, whether that be through exams, quizzes, homework, or classwork. What I'm a proponent for is grades with a basis of self-assessment and student-teacher dialogue. This would mean that students would thoroughly assess both themselves and their work. They would reflect on what they learned, how they learned, and why they learned. These self-assessments could be given like midterms and finals, or could be more frequently. And in case students and teachers disagree on a grade, then there should be dialogue in which all sides are addressed and a compromise is reached. This would work in unison with live feedback, where student work is evaluated as it's being made instead of after. This would allow students to really take feedback into consideration and implement it, or even rebuttal rather than ignoring it altogether. Many professors have already tried this model of grading. Juuso Henrik Nieminen, an educational researcher and assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong, performed a very similar model to what I'm proposing. In this experiment, a linear algebra class participated in the self-assessment. More specifically, there were 3 self-assessments given throughout the course of the class. The first assessment focused on the students' goals and how they felt they were doing, / how they mastered each subject. The second assessment was similar, however students were asked to provide a grade they thought they deserved for each subject learned so far. And the third assessment was summative, so like a final, and it allowed students to grade themselves on each subject and allowed them to provide an explanation for each. The final grades of these students who performed self-assessment were based on said self-assessment and a validation system. Now this isn't exactly what I propose, but even this form of self-assessment showed promising results. These results are shown best when Nieminen states, a frequent theme in the dataset was learning for myself, not for the teacher. The students largely reported that they were able to take control of their own studying now that they were sovereign in the grading process. Sovereign power was often used to direct resources, not for studying for an exam, but towards personal learning. This approach on its own would be extremely beneficial. However, I believe for it to be fully effective, other approaches need to be taken as well. I would urge for a switch away from exam-based learning to project-based learning. Project-based learning is an approach to education where students explore and inquire on real-world challenges while working on a project or multiple projects over an extended period of time to demonstrate their knowledge. Many schools use, or at least claim to use, this approach, including my high school. Even the class I'm making this project for uses this approach. This whole semester we focused on the question, what education means to us. And I've largely focused on the grading system and the impacts of it. And I feel that I've really deepened my knowledge and my exploration has felt really fulfilling and enjoyable at most times. To quote Buck Institute for Education, a big proponent for project-based learning, Students develop deep content knowledge as well as critical thinking, collaboration, creativity, and communication skills. Project-based learning unleashes a contagious, creative energy among students and teachers. This approach allows for more meaningful learning and ultimately more student growth. And in the same vein, collaboration needs to be promoted, not just through random group projects, but through class inquiry and class discussion. I would urge for more focus on dialogue and less on lecture, and through the ending of curved grades that pit students against one another. Ultimately, though, self-assessment, collaboration, and project-based learning all center around a student's voice in education. This approach to education lets students have more control over not only their grades, but over what and how they learn, all of which helps provide a more beneficial and meaningful experience to both students and teachers. Now, for my conclusion-ish. As a professor and as a teacher, you have a lot of responsibility, and I'm just a student, not a teacher. So I may not completely understand how difficult it can be or how hard you try, but I try my best to. And just as it's important for students to understand you and where you're coming from, you need to understand your students and where they're coming from. If you only take away one thing from this video, I hope it's the understanding of how important student and teacher dialogue is. Education is not only for students, it's for teachers as well. And we both can and we both should benefit from it. For us to benefit, we all need to understand one another. We all need a voice in the conversation. Thank you.